Some hailed James as a hero, praising him for standing his ground without escalating the situation. Others called out Margaret for her blatant racism, demanding accountability from people like her. For James, the attention was uncomfortable. He hadn't wanted to become a public figure or a viral sensation, but if his experience could spark conversations about prejudice and justice, he was willing to let it serve as a lesson. James Bryant sat at his kitchen table the next morning, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He rarely paid attention to social media, but today was different. His name, his car, and even the decoy safe had become trending topics. The video of Margaret's blue-painted meltdown had been uploaded by multiple witnesses, and the comments poured in by the thousands. Some praised James for his composure. This man handled himself with so much dignity. Hats off to him. That lady got what she deserved. Who even calls the cops on a guy just loading groceries into his car? SMH. But there were also darker corners of the internet, where people defended Margaret or criticized James for having the safe in the first place. What kind of person has a booby-trapped safe in their car? He must have been up to no good. She was just trying to protect her neighborhood. This is being blown out of proportion. James sighed. He didn't care about the online noise. What mattered to him was the truth. But he couldn't deny that the situation had stirred something bigger than himself. Margaret Sanders, meanwhile, was having a far less peaceful morning. The video had reached her employer, her friends, and even her family. Calls and emails flooded her inbox, many of them from people condemning her actions. Her boss at the local bank wasn't pleased. "Margaret, this kind of behavior reflects poorly on the company," he said during a tense phone call. "Well, need to discuss your future, I hear." At church that Sunday, the pastor addressed the congregation with a sermon about kindness, humility, and judgment. Though no names were mentioned, Margaret could feel the weight of the message directed squarely at her. Even her neighbors, who had once shared casual chats with her about property lines and gardening, began avoiding her. She had become infamous in her own community, a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice. A week later, James was invited to speak at a town hall meeting about his experience. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to relive the ordeal, but after some thought, he realized it was an opportunity to share his perspective and, perhaps, change some minds. Standing at the podium, James spoke with the quiet authority of a Navy officer. "I didn't ask for any of this," he began. "I just wanted to buy some groceries and go home. But what happened that day is something many people of color experience regularly. It's the assumption that we don't belong, that we're up to no good, simply because of how we look." The room was silent as he recounted the events, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I served this country for 20 years, he continued. "I've risked my life to protect the freedoms we all enjoy. And yet, in my own hometown, I was treated like a criminal for doing nothing but minding my own business. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. We have to do better." Margaret avoided the town hall, but the echoes of James' speech reached her. Watching the viral videos, seeing herself drenched in blue paint, she was forced to confront the ugly truth of her actions. At first, she tried to justify her behavior. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe," she told a friend. But the friend shook her head. "Margaret, you didn't see a threat, you saw a black man and made assumptions. That's not safety, that's prejudice." Her defenses crumbled as she realized how deeply she had wronged James. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt the sting of being ostracized, judged, and held accountable. The incident became a turning point for the town. Discussions about racism, bias, and accountability took center stage at community events. Local leaders organized workshops on diversity and inclusion, and the police department reviewed its protocols for handling racially charged incidents. For James, life slowly returned to normal. He continued his routines, his car now famous in the town as the car with the safe. While he appreciated the support, he hoped the lesson would extend beyond him. Maybe, he thought, this will make people think twice before judging someone based on appearances. Months later, Margaret showed up at James's doorstep, holding a small bouquet of flowers and looking humbled. "I came to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong, and am sorry for what I put you through." James studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's not me you need to convince," he said. "It's yourself. Learn from this." As Margaret left, James felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Saint maybe, people could change. After the incident, Margaret found herself consumed by the backlash. The days following were marked by sleepless nights and a growing awareness of her mistakes. For the first time, she started asking herself hard questions. She couldn't ignore the video. Every time she watched it, she saw a version of herself. She barely recognized a woman so caught up in suspicion and entitlement that she humiliated herself in front of the entire town. She hated what she saw. Margaret turned to the only person she thought could help her, her sister, Susan, who lived in another state and had always been more progressive in her views. "Why do people hate me for this?" Margaret asked during a tearful phone call. "I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand." Susan didn't sugarcoat her response. "Margaret, this isn't about people hating you. It's about you not seeing James as a person. You assumed the worst about him because of how he looked. Do you know how often people like James go through this? You owe him more than an apology, you owe him your respect." A month later, Margaret found herself at the local library. The community was hosting a discussion on bias, led by none other than James Bryant. She didn't plan to attend, but lingered in the lobby, curious. From the back of the room, Margaret listened as James spoke about his experiences, not just on that day, but throughout his life. "When I was 18, I enlisted in the Navy because I believed in this country," James said. "But believing in something doesn't mean it's perfect. Over the years, I've faced racism in ways big and small. That's the reality for people like me. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" His words stirred something in Margaret. She left the library that day with a resolution to do better. Margaret didn't want to approach James without understanding how to make amends. She began reading books on race and privilege, watching documentaries, and attending community workshops. When she finally felt ready, she wrote James a letter before visiting him. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Bryant, I am writing to you as a neighbor, as someone who wronged you deeply, and as someone trying to make amends. What I did to you that day was not just ignorant, it was harmful. I let my biases blind me, and I caused you pain and humiliation you did not deserve. I have spent the past few months reflecting on my actions and educating myself about the impact of prejudice. I understand now that an apology alone is not enough. I want you to know that I am committed to being part of the change our town needs. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me one day, though I know I have much work to do to earn that forgiveness. Sincerely, Margaret Sanders." James received the letter a week before Margaret showed up at his door. When he saw her standing there, bouquet in hand, he felt a mixture of emotions, anger, pity, and a flicker of hope. "Thank you for coming," James said after a long pause. "I read your letter. It takes courage to admit you were wrong." Margaret nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I just want to learn from this and be better." The story didn't end with Margaret's apology. Inspired by James's resilience and willingness to speak out, the town began holding regular community forums to address issues of race and equity. Margaret became an unexpected advocate, using her own experience as an example of how ignorance can cause harm and how education can lead to growth. As for James, he continued to live his life with the quiet dignity he always had. While he remained cautious of Margaret's transformation, he admired her efforts to make things right, not just with him, but with the entire community. For the town, the incident became more than a cautionary tale. It became a moment of reckoning, a chance to reflect and grow together. After Margaret's visit, James found himself reflecting on the strange journey they had shared. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and he didn't grant it lightly. He had seen too many people like Margaret offer apologies without changing their actions. But this time felt different. He had watched the town grapple with its biases, struggling to reconcile a single incident with larger systemic issues. Margaret's transformation was a symbol of that struggle. If she could take the first step, perhaps others could too. James wasn't naive. He knew not everyone would change, but he believed in planting seeds. If one person sees this and learns something, he thought, then maybe it was worth it. Margaret's path wasn't smooth. Her initial apology to James had been sincere, but the road to redemption required her to face uncomfortable truths about herself. She joined a local book club focused on understanding racism and privilege, where she read works like white fragility, and how to be an anti-racist. The discussions were difficult. She found herself questioning beliefs she'd held for decades, unraveling a lifetime of assumptions. Margaret also started volunteering at a community center, helping organize events that promoted inclusion and diversity. Through these efforts, she met people whose stories humbled her. A single mother who had faced housing discrimination, a young boy targeted by classmates for his accent, a father who had been profiled while walking in his own neighborhood. Each story deepened her understanding of the harm caused by prejudice, not just the obvious, like calling the police unnecessarily, but the subtle, like the way she had avoided certain neighborhoods or clutched her purse tighter around strangers. For the first time, Margaret felt a genuine desire to use her voice for good. The town wasn't immune to division. Not everyone agreed with the changes spurred by the incident. Some residents resisted the discussions about race, claiming the town was being too political or that they were tired of walking on eggshells, but others embraced the opportunity to grow. The local high school added curriculum on social justice to its history classes. The police department implemented training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. A mural was painted downtown, depicting people of different backgrounds standing together beneath the words, "Stronger Together." The changes didn't happen overnight, but they happened. One sunny afternoon, months after their last interaction, James and Margaret crossed paths at the farmer's market. Margaret hesitated, unsure if she should approach, but James saw her and gave a small nod, signaling it was okay. "How have you been?" Margaret asked, her voice tentative. "Good," James replied. "And you?" "I'm learning," she said honestly. "It's a process." James smiled faintly. "That's all any of us can do." They talked briefly about the changes in town, the workshops Margaret had been attending, and the ways James had quietly continued advocating for fairness and understanding. Though their conversation was brief, it felt significant, a bridge between past mistakes and future possibilities. The next year, Margaret was asked to speak at a town event commemorating Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Standing at the podium, she felt nervous but determined. She began with a confession. "A year ago, I made a terrible mistake. I let my biases cloud my judgment and caused harm to someone who deserved nothing but respect." Margaret shared her journey, how the incident with James had forced her to confront her prejudices, how she had educated herself, and how she hoped to inspire others to do the same. "This isn't just about one day or one event," she said. "It's about the choices we make every day. We have the power to see each other as equals, to listen, to learn, and to grow." The crowd applauded, and James, sitting quietly in the back, nodded in approval. For James, life continued peacefully, but he became a quiet cornerstone of the town's transformation. People sought his advice, his neighbors treated him with newfound respect, and young kids often asked him about his Navy days. His actions that day in the parking lot and the way he handled the aftermath had shown the town what grace under pressure looked like. James didn't ask for recognition, but he received it anyway. And though he would never say it aloud, he felt a small sense of pride in knowing he had helped make his community a little better than it was before. Though James outwardly appeared composed, the aftermath of the incident weighed heavily on him. Memories of similar encounters bubbled to the surface, moments when his character and intentions had been questioned for no reason other than in the color of his skin. He thought back to his days in the Navy, where he had fought tirelessly to earn respect. He remembered being one of the few black men in his unit and the extra effort it took to prove himself. There were whispers when he received promotions, questions about whether he had earned them. Yet he pushed forward, rising through the ranks with sheer determination. The incident with Margaret felt like a bitter reminder of the fight he thought he had left behind. But James refused to let it break him. Not everyone in Margaret's life supported her efforts to change. At a family gathering, her cousin Tom mocked her newfound activism. "So, you're one of those woke warriors now?" Tom sneered. "What's next? Apologizing for being white?" Margaret took a deep breath. A year ago, she might have laughed along or ignored him. Now, she felt a responsibility to speak up. "It's not about apologizing for being white," she said firmly. It's about recognizing that my actions hurt someone and doing something about it. If you think that's weakness, then maybe you should take a closer look at yourself.